For a brief, blinding stretch in the early 1990 seconds, they looked like the kind of couple pop culture invents and reality almost never delivers. Helena Christensen, the Danish Peruvian supermodel whose face slept on every magazine rack in the world. Michael Hutchence, the INXS frontman who could walk on stage and bend an arena around his little finger. Together they were young, beautiful, constantly in motion. The sort of people other people assumed were immune to ordinary damage. Then, one night in Copenhagen, a taxi driver's punch knocked Hutchence backwards. His head hit the pavement. When he woke up, something essential was gone. He could not smell. Food tasted like nothing, he joked, in a way that did not sound like a joke. That if he ever had a child, he would never know what his own baby smelled like. It was the kind of injury that does not show in photographs, the kind of slow collapse no camera catches. Helena watched the charismatic man the world thought it owned turn volatile, then lost, then unreachable. Years later, when he was found dead in a hotel room, everyone wrote their own story about what had happened to him. She kept most of hers to herself, long before that night on a Copenhagen pavement, before INXS and tabloids and hotel windows. Helena had already learned what it meant to have the world project stories onto you. She was born on Christmas Day, 1968 inches, Copenhagen, the daughter of a practical Danish father and a passionate Peruvian mother who had brought with her a different light, a different language, and a different sense of drama. Their apartment was not glamorous. It was small, ordered, ordinary. But even there, the idea of elsewhere was always in the room, in the music her mother played, in the Spanish drifting through phone calls, in the photographs of Lima and the Andes on the walls. In the northern European winter, Helena was a dark-haired child in a city of blonde heads, in a schoolyard of sturdy bodies. She was tall and thin before it was fashionable. A walking invitation for teasing. She has spoken, in that dry, understated way of hers, about how the jokes about her height and her skinniness did not really go away. You only learned to carry them differently. Being half Peruvian in a largely homogeneous Denmark in the 1970 seconds meant always being just slightly out of step, not enough to be an outcast, but enough to be reminded, in glances and careless comments, that you did not quite fit the default setting. She adapted the way children do. She listened more than she spoke. She watched. Her mother's intensity and her father's calm pulled at her in opposite directions. Somewhere between the two, Helena learned stillness, not the passive kind, but the kind that makes a room bend towards you without your having to move. She grew up speaking several languages not because anyone was trying to raise a cosmopolitan child, but because that was simply what survival required. Danish at school, Spanish with her mother, English and Swedish picked up along the way, a little French later in Paris. No one speaks Danish, she would say years later, with a shrug, so you just adapt. From the outside, her childhood looked uneventful. School, homework, long walks with her mother, summers that sometimes stretched to Peru, where the colors were louder and the air smelled of dust and fruit and exhaust. From the inside, two crucial things were happening. The first was that she was being looked at. Strangers commented on her eyes, on the angularity that made adults say, with that half-compliment that never really considers the child inside it, she could be a model one day. The second was that she was starting to look back. Before anyone paid her to stand in front of a camera, she was the one holding one, buying cheap film, taking pictures of friends and streets, and the play of light on kitchen tiles. By her mid-teens, the world caught up with what the schoolyard had already noticed. At 17, Helena entered, almost on a dare, the Miss Universe Denmark pageant. It was not her world. The choreography, the smiles, the rehearsed femininity of it all sat strangely on a girl who had never been comfortable with artifice. And yet she won. On paper, it sounded like the first chapter of a fairy tale. A girl from a modest Copenhagen home crowned the most beautiful woman in her country, sent to represent Denmark on a global stage. Up close, she felt something else. Pageants were about performance in the crudest sense. Walk this way, smile on cue, answer shallow questions with shallow charm. Later, she would say she felt awkward inside the entire setup, the way a person might feel wearing a borrowed dress that does not quite belong to them. What the pageant did give her was not a sense of belonging, but a door. It put her in front of people from agencies who were looking for faces that did not look like anyone else's. The Ford Models Look of the Year contest in 1987 was another of those doors. Helena did not win. She did not need to. The right people had seen her. Offers came. The life she knew in Copenhagen, its predictable streets, its gray water, its careful modesty, began to feel like a small room with the windows painted shut. When the chance came to leave for Paris, she took it. There is a romantic cliché about the girl arriving in Paris with a suitcase and a dream. The reality for Helena was less poetic and more disorienting. She landed not in some cinematic garret, but in a cramped model apartment with other girls from other countries, all of them jet-lagged, hungry, and pretending not to be afraid. Paris, in the late 1980 seconds, was fast, unforgiving, and utterly consumed by fashion. In Denmark, clothes had been just clothes. In Paris, they were currency, language, religion. The designers and photographers she began to meet were not treating fashion as a side interest. It was their life, their obsession, their entire vocabulary. Helena arrived in second-hand clothes because that was what she owned. She did not glide into castings with a polished entourage or rehearsed charm. She stood in lines, clutching a dog-eared composite card, waiting in hallways that smelled of perfume and cigarette smoke. When she stepped in front of casting directors, she did not perform exuberance. She simply stood there, tall and composed, with those watchful eyes. Some rooms dismissed her in seconds. Others stopped, really looked, and saw what the schoolyard and the pageant judges had already registered in less articulate ways, something arresting that was not easily reduced to pretty. The work did not come all at once. There were dry weeks, lonely weekends, phone calls home in which she smoothed over the rough edges so her parents would not worry. There were times when the weight of the city's indifference pressed down hard enough that going back to Copenhagen felt like the sensible option. But every time she was sure she had reached the end of the road, a small job would appear, a catalog shoot, an editorial test, a chance to be the unknown girl at the edge of someone else's frame. Each job bought her a little more time to figure out who she was supposed to be in a world that had opinions about her before she could form her own. Slowly, the pattern shifted. Fabrizio Ferri shot her in moody black and white, the grain of the film catching the tension between her stillness and the flickers of intensity. Underneath, Peter Lindbergh, with his insistence on authenticity over perfection, found in her face the kind of drama that did not need heavy styling. Herb Ritz saw how the camera loved the angles of her body, the way she could inhabit movement without seeming to strain for effect. Fashion, at that particular moment, was tired of safe prettiness. It wanted edges, ambiguity, women who looked like they had interior lives. Helena, who had never tried to present herself as anything but the mixture of calm and volatility that she was, slipped perfectly into that aesthetic. Then came the beige Hawaii beach, the black lava rocks that cut like broken glass, and a music video that would make her image truly inescapable. It was 1990. Chris Isaac's song Wicked Game was a slow burn on the radio, but it was Herb Ritz's video, two bodies on a beach, shot in luminous black and white, that turned it into an obsession. There was no plot, no choreography beyond the vague idea of lovers circling each other. It was just Helena and Isaac, the surf, the wind, and Ritz's eye. From a distance, it looked like a fantasy, a dream job. Two beautiful people rolling around in the waves. The reality was bone-deep cold. To get the look he wanted, Ritz had buckets of water thrown over Helena between takes so that her skin would gleam. The rocks shredded her feet. Isaac would later remember looking down and seeing blood running from small cuts on her legs and ankles. The kind of injuries that would never register on the camera. She did not complain. She wrapped her arms around herself between takes, trembled, and when the camera was rolling, she unfolded again into that unreadable, almost feline gaze past the lens. The unspoken rule was clear. The pain belonged to her. The image belonged to everyone else. When the video hit, it seemed to play on permanent rotation. The song climbed charts. Helena's face and body were suddenly familiar, even to people who never bought a fashion magazine. From there, the escalation was swift. There were covers for Vogue, Elle, Harper's Bazaar. There were campaigns for Revlon and Versace, runway shows in every major fashion capital. By the early 1990 seconds, the term supermodel had hardened into a kind of cultural shorthand. And Helena's name was one of the ones that came up automatically when people listed them. The other women of that era, Naomi Campbell, Christy Turlington, Linda Evangelista, Cindy Crawford, Claudia Schiffer, each generated their own mythology. Some chased the spotlight, some wielded it. Helena moved differently. She did not cultivate a public persona beyond the work. There were no widely circulated quotes about refusing to get out of bed for less than a certain sum. There were fewer interviews, fewer talk show appearances. On set, she worked, joked quietly with crew, then disappeared when the job was done. She did not see supermodel as an identity to be performed 24 hours a day. It was a job, albeit an extraordinary one. And when it was over, she wanted to go back to being a person. The industry, of course, rarely lets you make that distinction cleanly. The early 1990 seconds were a blur of flights, fittings and back-to-back bookings, Milan on Monday, New York by Wednesday, Tokyo the week after. The same body was expected to look weightless in couture one day, athletic in swimwear the next, seductive in lingerie the day after. No one was talking about mental health back then, Helena would say years later. The unspoken expectation was that you coped, you stayed thin, you stayed fresh, you did not age. If exhaustion showed in your eyes, someone fixed it in hair and makeup. If it crept past that, someone else fixed it in retouching. Like many of her peers, she learned to find pockets of quiet in the noise. Solitary walks in unfamiliar cities, long baths in anonymous hotel bathrooms, late-night calls home, mornings stolen for herself between red-eye flights and 6 a.m. call times. She knew other women who crumpled under the weight of it, whose names dropped off call sheets as quickly as they had been added. She was old enough, even in her early 20s, to understand that the ride would not last forever, and that if she did not build some kind of inner life to stand on when the bookings slowed, she would go down with the carousel. In the middle of that carousel, she fell in love with a rock star. Michael Hutchence walked into Helena's story with the same charisma he carried onto stages around the world. As the frontman of INXS, he was already an international icon by the time they met in the early 1990 seconds. He was all soft curls, dark eyes, and a kind of kinetic charm that made rooms lean towards him. They were introduced, depending on which version of the story you hear. Through friends, through fashion, through the vague osmotic overlap of two global touring circuits, one for music, one for modeling, that kept ending up in the same cities. From the outside, it looked absurdly perfect. She was one of the most photographed women in the world. He was the kind of performer who could turn a stadium into a single organism. They were photographed in airports, on beaches, backstage, always moving, always a little out of focus, as if the camera could barely catch them in time. They seemed, to strangers, like the sort of couple who lived in perpetual after-parties. Helena has said little over the years about those 4 years together. What does leak out, in the spare details she has allowed, is that for her, it was not a glamorous accessory to her own fame, but a real relationship with real depth. They nested in hotel rooms, cooked badly equipped meals in kitchens that did not belong to them, spent long stretches of time in each other's temporary worlds, her fashion cities, his touring cities, building something domestic inside lives that were anything but. Then, in 1992, there was the taxi in Copenhagen. The basic facts are public record. One night, out in her home city, there was an altercation with a taxi driver. A punch. Michael fell backwards, his head hitting the pavement. In the following days and weeks, it became evident that this was not just another drunken scuffle to be laughed off. He complained that he could not smell. Food tasted wrong. Then, not at all. Tests confirmed damage. There was talk of head trauma, of neurological complications. For a man whose life was built around sensory intensity, music, crowds, travel, physicality, suddenly living in a world that had gone partly blank was not a minor adjustment. It was a psychic shock. Helena was there for the aftermath. She has recalled him telling her, with a kind of bleak humor that did not disguise the grief underneath, that if he ever had a child, he would never know what his own baby smelled like. It is a small sentence, almost banal on the surface, but it contains the enormity of what he had lost. Smell and taste are intimate senses. They are how we know home, how we imprint on other bodies, how we anchor ourselves to our own lives. To lose them is not just an inconvenience, it is a dislocation. In the years that followed, people around Hutchence spoke of changes, mood swings, periods of darkness and volatility. A man whose confidence had once bordered on arrogance, becoming, at times, hollowed out and unreachable. Helena watched the man she loved move further and further away. Not in miles, but in some other measurement you can only feel when you share a bed with someone who no longer seems fully present in their own life. There were doctors, there were prescriptions, there were people eager to offer pills, fewer willing or able to offer the kind of sustained, complex care that a brain injury and its psychological fallout demand. She stayed as long as she could, loved him, through confusion, through anger, through the way his injury had turned both of them into reluctant students of neurology and psychiatry. But love does not always fix what is broken by a blow to the skull and years of untreated despair. By the mid-1990s, their relationship had unraveled. He moved on into a highly public relationship with television presenter Paula Yates. Helena did what she had always done when life became dangerously exposed. She went quiet. When Michael Hutchence was found dead in a Sydney hotel room in November 1997, the world rushed to have an opinion. There were lurid headlines, speculative documentaries, competing narratives about intent and circumstance. Ex-lovers were asked for comment. Helena said nothing. The man she had known had become public property in death as he had been in life. His story carved up and distributed for consumption. She kept her grief and her version of events, mostly to herself for years. Only much later, In the documentary, Mystify, did she speak more openly? Even then, she resisted melodrama. She did not claim exclusive insight. She simply told what she had seen. The accident, the loss of smell and taste, the way that loss rippled through his mental health, the quiet terror of watching someone you love become a stranger not through choice but through damage. It is notable that even when she finally allowed cameras to point at her for that chapter of her life, she did so in service of a film that tried to restore complexity to a man flattened by years of posthumous myth-making. Rather than to center herself, if the world remembers Helena Christensen with Michael Hutchence as half of a beautiful tragic couple, she remembers him as the man in the hospital corridor, the man frowning over a plate of food he could not taste, the man making bleak jokes about a future he could no longer picture clearly. Those are not images that fit easily into fashion spreads. After the peak of the supermodel era, at the point where many of her contemporaries either burned out or pivoted into celebrity-driven side businesses, Helena did something quieter and, in its own way, more subversive. She stepped behind the camera. The seeds had been there since childhood, and then we keyed. In the cheap cameras and rolls of film she burned through as a teenager. Throughout her modeling years, she had carried cameras with her, documenting life from the vantage point of someone always technically in the middle of the frame but internally standing just outside it. As fashion began to fetishize the next wave of faces, she began to ask a different question. What if she stopped being the subject and started framing the subject herself? Her photographs began to appear in magazines. Nylon, the publication she helped co-found in the late 1990 seconds, as well as titles such as Elle and Marie Claire. The work was not technically flashy. It was not trying to impress with complex lighting rigs or conceptual gimmicks. What stood out was the way she observed. Bodies half-turned, caught in between poses, hair blown not quite perfectly, clothes rumpled by real movement, light that fell as it did in life, rather than as it was ordered to on set. In a business that had spent decades insisting on polish, her pictures let imperfection in without fanfare. There was, inevitably, skepticism. The modeling world is full of people who decide, on a whim, that they are also photographers. But Helena kept at it, not as a hobby, but as a second career. She built trust with editors. She shot campaigns. She used, without apologizing for it, the access her first career had given her. To people, to places, to an understanding of how images are made and sold, and repurposed that access into a different kind of authorship, parallel to that. She constructed a life that did not obey the usual script for former supermodels. She had a son, Mingus, in 1999 with the Walking Dead actor Norman Reedus. Motherhood did not end her career, but it changed the way she moved through it. Work was no longer the unquestioned center. It was something to be weighed against school schedules, against the small, stubborn needs of a child who did not care how iconic his mother's wicked game gaze had been. Being a mother taught me to slow down, she has said, to be present, not always racing towards the next gate, the next backstage door, the next camera. As she aged into her 30s, 40s, and 50s, Helena refused the quiet erasure that fashion often reserves for women past a certain birthday. She continued to model selectively. She posted pictures of herself in lingerie and swimwear on social media, body unretouched, in ways that would have been unthinkable in the 1990 seconds. She did not label these images a campaign for body positivity. She did not attach manifestos. She simply existed in them as herself. Asked about confidence, she reduced it to something almost defiantly simple. It is mostly about not caring too much what other people think. There is a particular kind of scandal that attaches to women who age in public and refuse to behave as if they should be ashamed of it. For every person who celebrated Helena's ease with her own body, there were others ready with the usual litany of ageist, sexist commentary. She did not waste energy arguing with them. She had spent too many years in rooms where other people's opinions about her surface were treated as fact, to grant those voices any more power than they already had. Her connection to Peru, always a quiet current in her life, deepened. Through work with organizations such as Oxfam, she traveled to rural communities, meeting farmers and families living with the immediate realities of climate change and unstable access to clean water. The woman who had once been paid enormous sums to pose on tropical beaches now found herself standing in fields where drought or flood meant not a ruined photo shoot, but a ruined harvest. She listened more than she spoke. She lent her name and camera to projects that tried, however imperfectly, to bridge the obscene gap between the glossy imagery that had made her famous and the invisible labor that keeps the world functioning. There is another element to Helena's story that complicates the usual narrative of the supermodel who simply got lucky with good genes. Beauty, in her case, was always double-edged. It opened doors, paid bills, built a life that would have been unimaginable for a girl from a modest Copenhagen apartment. But it also created a kind of permanent surveillance. From the first contest sash to the first cosmetic contract, other people felt entitled to comment on, praise, critique, and dissect her face and body as if they were public property. Even sympathetic descriptions could feel, over time, like small thefts. Part of why photography suited her, later, is that it allowed her to reverse that equation, to be the one choosing what the world stares at, for how long, and on whose terms. Inside the fashion world, she became known for a kind of off-duty uniform that was the opposite of her on-camera glamour. Worn in jeans, simple shirts, men's jackets bought second-hand and worn for years. She recycled clothes, hung onto things, resisted the pressure to constantly reinvent her surface. To people who wanted the supermodel even at the corner cafe, this could read as aloofness. In reality, it was closer to self-defense. If strangers were going to project fantasies onto her regardless, she seemed to decide she might as well give them as little fresh material as possible. The person who walked into studios in the morning was not a character she woke up as. She was someone she assembled, piece by piece, and then quietly dismantled again at the end of the day. Over time, this separation between the image and the person hardened into a philosophy. She raised Mingus with a deliberate distance from the circus that had surrounded her own working life. There were no reality shows, no social media accounts run in his name, no glossy family spreads. When he later stepped briefly into modeling himself, it was on his terms, not as a prop in a narrative about his mother. Helena's own childhood had taught her what it meant to grow up in the long shadow of other people's choices. She seemed determined not to replicate that pattern. Fame may have been unavoidable in her line of work, but inheritance, she decided, could be edited, even in her friendships with other women from the same generation. The Cindys, Naomis, Christies and Lindas, whose faces had shared billboards with hers. Helena gravitated towards those who had likewise learned to build something sturdier beneath the surface. They appeared together again in campaigns and documentaries about the supermodel era, older now, laughing about the absurdity of the past, while also speaking more frankly about its cruelties. In those reunions, Helena often occupied the same familiar position she has held all her life, slightly to the side, observant, amused, adding a line that cuts to the heart of things and then retreating. It is not shyness, it is precision. She knows exactly how much of herself the story actually needs. When journalists press her to name regrets, she is wary of the question. The easy answer would be to denounce the fashion world entirely, to present herself as someone who escaped a toxic system and now stands above it. She refuses that script. She has been clear that the industry gave her extraordinary opportunities, friendships, a creative language, and the means to support herself and her family. It also brought loneliness, pressure, and the sharp knowledge of how quickly a person can be commodified. Both things can be true at once. The point, in her telling, is not to erase the past, but to be honest about its cost, and to insist on something better for the next generation of women who will inevitably be drafted into the same machine. What makes Helena Christensen's story feel unfinished, even now, is that she has never paused to declare a definitive third act. There is no grand farewell to modeling, no solemn announcement that she is now only a photographer or only an activist. She slips between roles as she always has, following curiosity rather than brand strategy. One month she might appear in a campaign that nods wryly to her 1,990 seconds image. The next she might be somewhere in South America, ankle deep in mud, lining up a shot of a farmer at dawn. In between, she returns to Copenhagen, to New York, to the ordinary logistics of a life populated by friends, family, colleagues, and strangers who recognize her in the grocery store and, more often than not, leave her alone. The industry that once put her face everywhere now has a different relationship to her. She is treated as a kind of elder stateswoman, of a supermodel generation that, for a while, seemed like it might never age. Young models cite her as an influence. Photographers who once watched Herb Ritz's Wicked Game on loop now find themselves on set with the woman from that video, or being directed by her. Brands court her for campaigns not because of nostalgia alone, but because she still carries, in front of and behind the camera, that rare thing she had as a teenager, turning up to Paris castings in second-hand clothes, an unforced presence. Helena Christensen did not burn the fashion system down. She did something more modest and, perhaps, more sustainable. She learned how to step in and out of it without letting it claim the whole of her. She allowed the world to have her image while quietly keeping her life. The pain of the rocks on that Hawaii beach, the sting of being mocked in a schoolyard, the helplessness of watching a partner's mind tilt after a blow to the head, those belong to her. The photographs, the videos, the mythologies belong to everyone else. If you search her name now, you will still find the same iconic frames, the Wicked Game beach, the early 90 seconds covers, the runway shots in Chanel or Versace. You will also find her own photographs, images of other people caught in that same liminal space she has always occupied, between pose and reality, between what the world wants to see and what a person is willing to show. You might see a picture she has taken of a stranger in Peru, or a friend in a kitchen, or a model half turned away from the lens. Somewhere in there is Helena's quiet revenge on a life spent being looked at. She gets to decide what is seen now, and somewhere, in the background of her story, that night in Copenhagen still echoes. A taxi, a fist, a head hitting the ground, a man waking up in a world that no longer smelled like his own, a woman sitting beside him, understanding in her bones how quickly a life can be rewritten by an impact no camera can capture. She did not speak about it for years. When she finally did, it was not to center her own hurt, but to insist that his story be told with the complexity he had been denied. For a brief, blinding stretch in the early 1,990 seconds, Helena Christensen and Michael Hutchence looked like they were immune to ordinary damage. They were not. No one is. The difference is that most people's fractures are not broadcast, replayed, and monetized. So when you look at Helena's face in those famous photographs now, the sea spray on her skin, the unreadable eyes, the body frozen forever in some impossible standard of youth, it is worth remembering that somewhere just outside the frame There is blood on the rocks. There is cold wind. There is someone calling, one more take. And, somewhere, years later, there is a woman in a dark editing suite going through contact sheets of images she has made herself, deciding, quietly and finally, which fragments of reality she is willing to let the world own this time and which she will keep.